Dawn in Dry Creek always came the same way, slow, smoky, and red as embers dying in a long-burned fire. The sun would climb over the ridge behind the Murray place, stretching its warm fingers across the valley. And that was when Dean Murray, the town's quiet blacksmith and wagon-fixing cowboy, pushed open the creaking door of his workshop. The place was small, almost humble, built from weathered pine boards that smelled of resin and old storms. But when Dean stepped inside, it felt like a cathedral of sweat and metal, a world forged by calloused hands, glowing iron, and the relentless rhythm of a hammer meeting hot steel. He lived alone in the little cabin beside the shop, no bigger than a hay shed, with a tin roof that rattled like old bones whenever the evening wind swept through. There were no fancy things inside, just a narrow bed, a wood stove, a table battered by years of use, and a single shelf holding a tin coffee pot. But Dean had never asked for more. Life had taught him early that a man didn't need much, so long as he had work worth doing and a place to lay his head when night fell. Every morning before most of the town had even stirred, he fed the fire in the forge until it roared alive, then set to his day, shaping horseshoes, mending broken axles, resetting wagon wheels, tightening bolts loosened by the rough desert trails. He worked with a patient strength, the kind born not from pride but from purpose. His hands, scarred, burn-marked, reliable, moved with steady certainty, as if they knew exactly who he was, even on days when he wasn't sure himself. Folks in town said Dean was quiet as creekstone. He didn't talk much, never wasted breath on things that didn't matter. He nodded instead of argued, listened instead of bragged. And though he was young, there was an oldness to him, a weathered grace that made people trust him with their troubles, their horses, and their battered wagons. Dust clung to him like a second skin, and the scent of hot iron and pine wood followed him wherever he went. But beneath all that simplicity, Dean carried one private hope, one small dream he never spoke aloud. Every silver coin he earned, he tucked away in a wooden box beneath the floorboards of his cabin. Week after week, month after month, the pile grew slowly, painfully, like water dripping into a desert canteen. He skipped meals sometimes, turned down nights at the saloon, took extra repair jobs even when his shoulders ached and his fingers throbbed from a full day's hammering. He did it all for her. Claire, the bright-eyed girl from town with ribbons in her hair and a voice soft as spring rain. She worked at the general store, greeting travelers with a smile that made Dean's dusty heart stumble inside his chest. She was everything Dry Creek wasn't, polished, hopeful, dreaming of things far beyond their little valley, and somehow she'd once looked at him like he was part of those dreams. Dean had nothing to offer her except honesty, devotion, and the future he was determined to build piece by piece. So he saved, and saved, and saved. The plan, his one secret, stubborn plan, was to buy her a ring, a simple gold band. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would glint like jewelry from the city, but real, honest, a promise forged from every long hour he had ever worked. He pictured the moment 100 times while shaping horseshoes or tightening wagon bolts. The two of them standing under the open sky, the red dust swirling at their boots, the scent of hot sagebrush drifting through the air. He'd hold out the ring, she'd smile, maybe cry, maybe laugh that small, musical laugh of hers, and for once life would feel less heavy, less lonely. He didn't ask for riches or praise or a name carved into the world. All Dean Murray wanted was a quiet home of his own, a warm table, and Claire's hand resting in his at the end of each long day. That was why he worked himself to the bone, why he ignored the blisters and the burn scars, why he kept going even when the evenings felt too empty to bear. The Western frontier was a hard place, wild, dusty, and unforgiving, but Dean believed there was room in it for something gentle, something steady, something like love. And so, under the heat of his forge and the wide skies of Dry Creek, he continued shaping not just iron, but a future he prayed would soon belong to two. Dean Murray first met Claire Whitmore on a windswept afternoon when her wagon wheel cracked clean through on the rocky trail outside Dry Creek. She had been standing beside the tilted wagon, skirts dusty, cheeks flushed with frustration, whipping flies away with the back of her hand. Dean had been riding home from a supply run, and without thinking twice, because helping folks was as natural to him as breathing, he'd pulled his horse to a stop. "Need a hand, ma'am?" he asked, voice low and steady. She turned, and her whole expression brightened, like the sun had finally pushed through storm clouds. Claire had that effect. Radiant, charming, effortless. And when Dean knelt beside the broken wheel and began tightening bolts with practiced confidence, she watched him like he was some kind of hero. That was how it started. For a while, their love was gentle, simple, almost sweet enough to soften the harsh edges of frontier life. Dean would meet her after sundown at Harper's Saloon, where lantern light flickered amber across her features as they shared bowls of stew and cornbread. She'd talk about her day at the general store, how she liked greeting travelers and hearing stories from folks passing through. He'd tell her about the forge, the wagons he'd repaired, the stubborn horses he'd shod. They weren't fancy dates, not by any stretch, but they were the kind where two people leaned close because they wanted to, not because the room was small. Some evenings, when the heat of summer clung to the valley, Claire would ride out with Dean into the lower Dry Creek ravine. They'd let their horses walk slow while the sky blushed purple above them. Claire's laughter, light, fluttering, would bounce off the canyon walls. Dean never minded being quiet next to her. Listening felt like enough. On colder nights, they'd build a fire behind his workshop. Dean would toss scraps of pine wood into the flames, while Claire wrapped herself in his coat. She liked the scent of smoke and iron that clung to it, said it smelled like honest work. Dean believed her. Back then, everything she said sounded true. But seasons change, and so do people. The first shift was small, so small Dean almost missed it. Claire began commenting on the soot on his shirt, or how the smell of hot metal stuck to him even after he washed. She'd wrinkle her nose, smile a little too tight, and ask, "Dean, don't you ever wish for more?" He didn't know what more meant. He had food, work, and a woman who said she cared for him. What else could a man reasonably want? But Claire's gaze started drifting, toward the nicer wagons rolling through town, toward the well-dressed cattle buyers with polished boots and smooth hands. She'd watch them as if they were windows into a world she secretly believed she deserved. One evening at the saloon, while Dean was telling her about a wagon axle he'd fixed, she cut him off abruptly. "Dean, does it ever bother you that you're always covered in soot? That you'll always be the man folks come to when something breaks?" She didn't say it cruelly, but she didn't have to. The sting landed all the same. Dean swallowed his pride, unsure how to answer. "It's honest work," he finally said. "It's who I am." Claire looked at him like that was exactly the problem. As weeks passed, the gap widened. She grew restless, tapping her fingers on the table whenever he talked about his shop, her eyes drifting to the saloon doors as if waiting for someone better to walk through. She spoke more often about the city, about dresses made of imported silk and restaurants with chandeliers and string music. She said she wanted a life with sparkle, with possibilities. Dean offered her the only sparkle he had, stars above them during their canyon rides, but it wasn't enough. The day she told him she hated the forge was the day something inside him sagged. "Dean, you're a good man," she said, voice careful as if handling something fragile. "But I don't want to live my entire life smelling smoke and horse sweat. Don't you ever dream beyond this dusty little town?" He did dream. Of her, of a home, of a simple life built with love instead of gold. But Claire dreamed differently. No matter how gently she spoke, the truth hit like a hammer blow to hot steel. They weren't standing on the same ground anymore. Dean kept saving money anyway, kept imagining a future where love could outweigh the difference between them. But deep in his chest, he felt it. A slow, growing distance, quiet as dusk, sure as nightfall. A distance that would soon become heartbreak. By late autumn, the wooden box beneath Dean Murray's floorboards was finally heavy enough to make his hands shake when he lifted it. Inside lay every spare coin he'd earned, payments from wagon repairs, horseshoe fittings, axle straightenings, and long, lonely days working in the dry heat of Dry Creek. And with those coins, he bought what he believed was the most meaningful thing he could ever offer: a small gold ring from the town jeweler. It wasn't extravagant, not by any stretch. The jeweler placed it in his palm with a shrug, saying, "Simple but honest, just like you, Murray." And Dean smiled because that was all he wanted, a ring that told the truth about the man offering it. All week, he rehearsed what he'd say, practicing in the mirror, whispering under his breath while hammering iron. The words were never fancy, but they came from the deepest part of him. So when Friday evening rolled in with a soft breeze and a lavender sky, Dean saddled his horse, wiped the soot from his shirt as best he could, and headed to the Silver Lantern, the finest restaurant Dry Creek had, oil lamps on every table, velvet curtains faded by desert sun, and a piano that played only when someone sober enough to try sat down. Claire was waiting outside in a blue dress that shimmered like creek water at dusk. For a moment, looking at her, Dean felt hope bloom in his chest again. She smiled politely, pretty, distant, and took his arm. Inside, lanterns cast warm gold across the room. The smell of roasted beef and fresh bread drifted through the air. Cowboys, ranch hands, merchants, and travelers filled the tables, their murmured conversations rising and falling like quiet waves. Dean pulled out Claire's chair. She sat gracefully, a woman who seemed more suited for city ballrooms than dry frontier towns. They talked, but it was nothing like before. Claire spoke about merchants from Santa Fe, about dresses she'd seen in traveling catalogs, about new opportunities she hoped would come to Dry Creek soon. Dean nodded, listening, even when her words made him feel like a man standing on the wrong side of a window. When dessert arrived, sweet pudding for her, black coffee for him, Dean knew this was the moment. His heart pounded, his palms grew damp, and everything else in the room blurred into nothing. He pushed his chair back, stood, then slowly lowered himself onto one knee beside her. The restaurant quieted. Forks stopped midair. Conversations died like snuffed-out candles. "Claire," he said, voice trembling but earnest, "you're the best part of my days. I want a life with you, a home, a future. Will you marry me?" He opened the box. The small gold ring glowed softly under the oil lamp. Humble, sincere, carrying every ounce of love he knew how to give. But Claire didn't smile. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. Her brows pinched together, her lips drawing into a tight line. She stared at the ring as if it were a cracked horseshoe he'd mistakenly handed her. "That's it," she whispered. "Dean, it's so small." The room stiffened. A few ranch hands exchanged awkward looks. One woman covered her mouth. Claire continued, louder this time, her voice slicing the silence. "It looks cheap. I can't wear something like that. Not as an engagement ring." Dean felt the heat rise in his cheeks, spreading to his ears. The ring suddenly felt heavy in his hand, like a stone sinking into deep water. "Claire, it's what I could afford," he murmured, fighting to steady his voice. "I know," she cut in, rising from her chair. "And that's exactly the problem." Someone at a nearby table muttered, "Damn shame." But Claire didn't care. She smoothed her skirt, lifted her chin, and walked toward the door, leaving Dean still kneeling, still holding the ring, still hoping this was some kind of nightmare the frontier dust would blow away. But the only thing that moved was the restaurant door as it shut behind her. Dean slowly rose, swallowed the burn in his throat, and closed the ring box with shaking fingers. The piano in the corner resumed its lonely tune. Voices picked up again, but softer, heavy with pity. He paid the bill, walked out into the cold desert night, and stood there for a long time, staring at the empty street where Claire had vanished. 3 days later, a folded slip of paper arrived at his door. No signature, no apology, just 8 words. "We are finished. I want more than this." No tears, no regret, just an ending as sharp and merciless as the frontier wind. And Dean Murray, cowboy, blacksmith, dreamer, was left alone with nothing but a ring that no longer had a future. In the days that followed Claire's departure, Dry Creek felt different to Dean Murray, harsher, emptier, as if the wind itself had learned her words and whispered them back to him every time it swept through town. Not good enough. He returned to his forge because work was the only thing he'd ever known how to steady himself with. But he moved through the shop like a ghost wearing boots. The once purposeful clang of his hammer, strong, rhythmic, confident, became dull, uneven, almost hesitant. Neighbors who brought horses or wagons for repair stopped at the open doorway, unsure whether to interrupt the hollow man working inside. Dean barely spoke to them. A nod here, a quiet grunt there. No stories, no small talk, no warmth. His eyes seemed older, shadowed, the bright ember of hope inside him smothered under the ashes of humiliation. Every morning he woke before dawn, Not because he wanted to, but because sleep no longer stayed long enough to comfort him. He'd pour cold coffee from yesterday's pot, swallow it like medicine, and step into the workshop, still wearing the same soot-stained shirt, still carrying the same heaviness in his chest. Tools lay scattered on the floorboards, horseshoes half-finished, nails spilled from canvas bags like forgotten seeds. The place had once reflected his steady spirit. Now it echoed his unraveling. At night, the forge never quite cooled, because Dean would stand beside it long after the heat became unbearable, just staring into the red glow, letting it blur his vision. Sometimes it reminded him of the moment he'd opened that ring box in the silver lantern, how hopeful he'd been, how the room had seemed to expand with possibility. Now every flicker of flame looked like mockery. His home fared no better. The cabin that once smelled faintly of pine and leather now carried a stale scent of untouched food and dust. Dishes stacked in the sink, laundry piled in a corner. The floor creaked beneath his boots, not because he walked heavily, but because he'd forgotten how to move with purpose. And on the small wooden table, center of the room, impossible to ignore, sat the gold ring. The same ring he had held with shaking hands. The same ring Claire had dismissed with a curled lip in a single unforgiving sentence. It's too small, too cheap. Dean avoided looking at it, but that never worked. Every time he passed through the cabin, the ring caught the weak morning light or the dim lantern glow, glinting like a wound that refused to heal. It was no longer a symbol of hope or a future. It had become a weight, a reminder, a cruel little echo of everything he wasn't. A man who worked with iron wasn't easily broken, but heartbreak has a way of finding the cracks and driving itself deep. Dean felt it in his bones, in the slow drag of his steps, in the heaviness behind his eyes. He skipped meals, sometimes forgetting, other times simply not caring. His stomach felt knotted, as if the humiliation had lodged itself there and refused to be digested. He dropped weight. His beard grew uneven. His hands, once precise and steady, shook when he tried to mend a wagon wheel. Even the horses sensed something was wrong. They'd stamp nervously when he approached, ears twitching as if recognizing the sadness rolling off him like heat from desert sand. Neighbors whispered, not out of cruelty but concern, "That Murray boy ain't right. He's working himself hollow. You'd think a man like him could shake off a broken heart, but frontier heartbreak doesn't shake off easily. It settles like dust, fine, stubborn, everywhere." And Dean lived in it. He breathed it. He carried it like a burden strapped tight to his shoulders. For the first time in his life, work didn't save him. For the first time, his strength meant nothing. Because no matter how many wagon wheels he repaired, no matter how many horses he shoed, no matter how long he stood beside the forge trying to burn the memory away, Claire's voice clung to him like burrs on denim. "Not good enough." Those three words cut deeper than steel, sharper than any tool in his shop. They turned a strong cowboy into a silent wanderer inside his own life. Alive, but not living. Yet even as the days blurred together in a haze of dust and sorrow, fate was shifting somewhere beyond the valley. Someone with dark eyes and a quiet strength all her own, was about to step into Dean Murray's world. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The morning Dean Murray first noticed the Apache woman living in the neighboring clearing, he was in no state to meet anyone, much less someone who would one day change the entire rhythm of his worn-out life. The sun had barely climbed over the hills, painting the valley in rusty oranges, when Dean found himself wrestling, again, with the same busted wagon wheel he'd been trying to fix for 2 days. His hands were steady, but his heart wasn't. Every bolt he tightened seemed to echo Claire's voice in the back of his mind. Every slip of a wrench reminded him how little sleep he'd gotten. Every failed attempt pushed him deeper into frustration. Finally, when the wooden rim splintered beneath his grip and refused to align, something inside him snapped. Dean reared back and kicked the wheel hard, sending it wobbling across the dirt with a clumsy, mocking bounce. He cursed under his breath, something he rarely did, and ran a hand through his hair, exhausted, ashamed of losing his temper like a rookie ranch hand. He didn't notice the pair of dark eyes watching him from the tree line, not until he heard a soft laugh. Not mocking, not rude, just amused, warm like a fire cracking in winter. "You fix wagons often by kicking them, cowboy?" a woman's voice asked. Dean spun around. Standing a few paces away was a young Apache woman with a calm, steady posture and an expression that somehow managed to be both gentle and sharp. Her skin was sun-kissed, the color of warm earth. Long black hair flowed down her back with two eagle feathers braided near the temple, swaying with the breeze. Around her neck hung a thin string of handmade beads, turquoise and amber catching the light in soft glimmers. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered storms and learned not to bow to them. I wasn't planning on it, Dean muttered. The woman stepped closer, the hem of her doe-skin skirt brushing lightly against the grass. Though she moved with grace, Dean could tell she was strong, built from years of mountain trails, river crossings, and work that didn't care whether you were tired. My name is Vivian, she said. I live over there. She pointed toward a small canvas and wood dwelling tucked beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of his land. Dean had noticed smoke rising there in recent weeks, but never bothered to investigate. He'd been too sunk in his own misery. Dean Murray, he replied quietly, rubbing the back of his neck. Vivian looked at the scattered tools, the half-broken wheel, the battered expression on his face. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry. Instead, she held out a small cloth bundle. For you. Dean blinked. What's this? Cornbread. Fresh. Just came off my fire. Her lips curved with a small, teasing smile. You look like you haven't eaten since last winter. Dean let out an awkward breath, half laugh, half disbelief. No one had brought him anything since Claire left. Certainly no one had looked at him with eyes that saw past the soot on his shirt or the shadows in his expression. He took the warm bundle carefully as if it might break. When he unwrapped it, the smell of sweet corn and wood smoke drifted up, a scent so comforting he almost forgot how tight his chest had been for weeks. Thank you, he said, voice softer than he meant. Vivian crouched beside the fallen wheel, inspecting it with that sharp gaze of hers. Things stubborn, she said, but stubborn things can be fixed. They just take patience, and maybe fewer kicks. Dean flushed a little. Yeah, I guess I wasn't thinking straight. She straightened and met his eyes. Truly met them. Most men don't when they're carrying something heavy inside. Her words were simple, but they struck deeper than he expected. No pity, no judgment, just recognition, understanding. Something no one had offered him since the night his life fell apart under lantern light. He didn't know what to say, and Vivian didn't demand anything from him. She simply gave him a nod, like acknowledging the weight he bore was enough for today. Well, she said softly, if you need another pair of hands or more bread, you know where to find me. Then she walked back toward her clearing, feathers swaying, beads catching sunlight like tiny promises. Dean stood there long after she was gone, holding warm cornbread in calloused hands. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, something inside him unclenched. Just a little, just enough to breathe again. After their first meeting, Vivian Reed seemed to slip into Dean Murray's days, the way warm sunlight slips through cracked barn boards, quietly, naturally, without force. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was a series of small moments, ordinary tasks, shared silences, the kind of slow-growing connection only frontier life could nurture. At first, she came by with excuses so thin Dean could have seen daylight through them. One morning, she walked over holding a wagon axle. It squeaks, she said, though Dean found nothing wrong with it except a bit of dust. Another day, she led her old sorrel mare into his yard. Her shoe feels loose, she claimed. Dean checked and saw the nails were tight as a drum. Still, he pried off the old shoe and fitted a new one, while Vivian watched with bright curiosity. Sometimes she brought nothing except a basket covered with woven cloth. Dinner, she'd say, smiling. Inside would be roasted venison, cornbread baked over hot stones, or a fragrant stew of beans and peppers seasoned the Apache way. The meals were simple but rich, carrying the warmth of someone who put heart into every ingredient. While Dean ate, often embarrassed by how quickly he finished, Vivian would tell him stories from her people. Tales of ancient hunters who followed the eagle's shadow, or myths about thunder spirits who lived inside the storm clouds. Her voice was steady, low, almost melodic, carrying the cadence of centuries. Dean rarely talked about himself, but Vivian didn't push. She simply sat beside him, sometimes close enough that he could smell the faint scent of sage smoke in her hair. In return, Dean found small ways to show he cared, though he never called it that. He repaired the sagging fence around her clearing, slamming posts deep into the desert soil with a strength she quietly admired. He chopped firewood and stacked it beside her lodge, pretending he was just passing through. He carried water from the creek when the summer heat became unbearable. He didn't do these things because she asked. He did them because he wanted to, because helping her felt right. And slowly, Vivian began opening parts of herself rarely shown to anyone. Sitting by the river one evening, she whispered about her childhood in the mountains, her mother's lullabies, and the ache of belonging to two worlds, one Apache, one settler, and never fully fitting into either. Dean listened, elbows resting on his knees, letting her words wash over him like cool creek water. "You ever feel alone even with people around?" she asked quietly. Dean nodded. He didn't trust his voice enough to speak. Life between them settled into a rhythm, soft, unhurried, as natural as the desert wind. They rode into town together for supplies, tying their horses to the same post. They led livestock to the river when the afternoon sun grew fierce, their boots kicking dust in tandem. Some nights, when the sky turned violet and crickets sang, they cooked supper over a small fire outside her lodge. Those evenings were the closest thing to peace Dean had known in years. One night, after they finished eating, Vivian wandered into his cabin to return a tool she'd borrowed. Her eyes landed on the wooden table. On it lay the small gold ring, the same one Claire had mocked, the same one that had sat untouched for weeks like a bruise he couldn't cover. Vivian picked it up delicately, rolling it between her fingers. "May I?" she asked. Dean hesitated but nodded. She slipped it onto her finger. It slid on smoothly, resting snug and natural, as if molded for her hand. Vivian raised her hand toward the lamplight. The ring glimmered. Not flashy, not grand, but warm and honest. "Fits," she murmured. "Feels right." Dean swallowed hard. "It's nothing fancy." She shook her head gently. "Fancy doesn't mean good." Then she looked him in the eyes. Really looked at him. "Sometime," she said softly, "the things that fit us best aren't the ones that shine the brightest, but the ones made with real care." Her words didn't just land, they healed. Quietly, deeply. In places Dean didn't think could heal anymore. In that moment, the ring no longer felt like a symbol of failure. It felt like the beginning of something new, something steady, something honest. And Dean Murray, broken not long ago, felt the first true warmth return to his chest. Storms in Dry Creek didn't come often, but when they did, they came like the whole sky had decided to break open. That night, clouds rolled over the valley like a herd of wild buffalo, heavy and restless. The wind had teeth, sharp, cold, relentless. By sundown, thunder was already grumbling across the plains, and lightning flickered like broken lanterns behind the hills. Dean Murray tried to focus on repairing a saddle strap inside his workshop, but something in the wind unsettled him. The cottonwoods at the edge of his property bent violently, their branches snapping like bones. Every crack made him glance toward the small clearing where Vivian lived. When the storm finally hit, it hit hard. Rain slammed against the roof in thick, pounding sheets. The wind howled so fiercely that the forge chimney rattled. Dean paced the length of his shop, unable to shake the feeling twisting in his gut. Then he heard it, a thud, a heavy, splintering crash, right from Vivian's direction. He didn't hesitate. Dean threw on his coat, shoved open the door, and ran into the storm. Mud splashed under his boots, rain soaked him instantly, and the wind shoved at him with wild force. But he kept going, pushing through the dark until the silhouette of her lodge appeared. A large cottonwood branch had smashed into the roof, tearing through the canvas and wooden supports. Through the ripped flap, he saw a flicker of lamplight, and Vivian, crouched low, her hands braced against the trembling frame. "Vivian," he shouted over the storm. She looked up, and the relief on her face hit him like a blow to the chest. "Dean, thank the spirits you're here," she breathed, voice shaking though she tried desperately to steady it. He ducked inside, grabbing her shoulders just as another gust made the lodge groan. Rain dripped from her hair, trailing down her cheek. She wasn't crying, but she was shaking, ever so slightly. The sight of it, of her trying to stay brave in a falling shelter, ignited something fierce and protective in him. "We have to wait it out," Dean said. "The wind's too strong to fix anything right now." Lightning cracked close by. Vivian flinched despite herself. Dean moved closer, gently placing his hands around her upper arms. grounding her. "Hey," he murmured, his voice low, steady, anchored. "You're safe with me. No one, nothing, will hurt you while I'm here." She closed her eyes as if letting those words settle somewhere deep. Rain drummed against the broken roof, but inside the lodge, time slowed. The soft glow of the lantern cast warm light across their faces, softening the shadows beneath their eyes. Vivian took a shaky breath and stepped forward, not collapsing, not clinging, but leaning into him with quiet trust. Her forehead touched his chest, right above his heartbeat. "Don't go," she whispered, almost lost beneath the storm's roar. "Stay. Just stay." Dean's arms moved around her instinctively. Not greedy, not rushed, just steady. Protective. Present. Her hair smelled faintly of sage and smoke, warm even in the cold storm. He rested his chin lightly against the top of her head, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel hollow. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and he meant it with every part of him. They stood like that for a long time, two worn souls bracing against a world that had dealt them both more pain than they deserved. Outside, lightning tore across the sky in blinding streaks. Wind shrieked through the trees, but in the small circle of space where they held each other, the storm felt distant, muted, almost irrelevant. Vivian's breathing gradually steadied. Her trembling faded. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. Dark, reflective, softened by gratitude he could feel more than see. "You came for me," she said softly. Dean brushed a raindrop from her cheek with a thumb roughened by years of ironwork. "Of course I did." There was no kiss, no confession, nothing rushed. Just a moment that settled deep, like roots pushing into fertile earth. A moment that said without words, "You matter. You're not alone anymore." In the heart of a violent frontier storm, Dean Murray, once broken, once hollow, found something tender growing again. Something that frightened him with its intensity but steadied him all the same. After the stormy night when Vivian leaned into Dean's chest and asked him to stay, something subtle yet profound shifted between them. They did not name it, did not chase it, did not rush to define it, but it was there, quiet, warm, steady as the morning sun rising over Dry Creek. From that day on, Vivian fell naturally into Dean's routine, as if she had always belonged beside him. Every sunrise, she would walk to his workshop while tying her long hair into a loose braid, feathers brushing her shoulders. Together, they made their rounds through town, checking wagon wheels, tightening harness straps, straightening axles for ranchers and travelers. Dean worked with renewed focus, his once heavy silence now softened by Vivian's calm presence beside him. She'd kneel beside the wheels, handing him tools, learning the names of each bolt and brace. Sometimes the townsfolk watched them with curious eyes, but neither of them seemed to mind. For the first time since Claire shattered him, Dean didn't feel alone in his work. In return, he spent his afternoons helping Vivian reclaim a patch of dry, stubborn soil behind her lodge. She wanted to grow her mother's medicinal herbs, sage, yarrow, sweetgrass, and a few rare plants her people used for healing. Dean dug rows with a patience he hadn't felt in months, hands deep in the earth, listening as Vivian explained the meaning behind each herb. "This one," she said, lifting a fragile sprout, "is for wounds you can see. And this one," touching a soft-leafed plant, "is for the wounds you can't." Dean didn't ask which kind she thought he needed. He already knew. One afternoon, while they planted seedlings, a scruffy gray stray wandered into the yard, ribs sharp beneath wiry fur, tail wagging hopefully. Vivian froze, unsure whether the dog was wild or simply desperate. But Dean knelt, whistled gently, and the animal trotted straight into his arms as if recognizing kindness. "Well," Dean murmured, stroking the dog's scruffy head, "looks like we got company." The dog stayed, had no name for a while, until Vivian started calling him Dusty, because he always rolled in dirt patches the moment Dean cleaned him. As days stretched into weeks, evenings became their favorite time. They would sit on the porch steps of Dean's cabin, the boards still warm from the day's sunlight. Dusty curled at their feet, snoring softly. From where they sat, they could hear distant hoofbeats from ranchers returning home, or the soft clatter of wagons in town. The valley spread before them in shades of gold and violet, peaceful in a way neither of them took for granted. Dean began to laugh again, deep, quiet laughs that rumbled in his chest. It wasn't loud or showy. It was the kind of laugh that comes from a man remembering what hope feels like. Vivian noticed. She would watch him from the corner of her eye, smiling gently, because every piece of joy he regained felt like a small victory. For her, the healing went deeper. Vivian had spent years drifting, caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither. But here, with Dean, she felt anchored, seen, accepted without question or condition. The loneliness she had carried like a second skin began to peel away. One evening, as the sky dimmed to soft amber, Vivian leaned her head against Dean's shoulder. "What do you dream about?" she asked. Dean hesitated, then replied honestly, "A workshop bigger than this one. A place where I can fix any wagon that rolls through Dry Creek." He paused. "And maybe a home that never feels empty again." Vivian's fingers brushed lightly over his hand. "I want a small piece of land," she said, "where I can grow every herb my mother taught me. A place no one can take from us." The word "us" hung in the air, delicate, unspoken yet undeniable. Dean swallowed. "Think that's possible?" Vivian turned to face him fully, her dark eyes reflecting the last streak of twilight. "I think," she said softly, "that simple dreams are the strongest kind. They don't need much, just the right people." He felt those words settle deep inside him, deeper than any wound Claire had left. For the first time, Dean allowed himself to imagine not just a future, but a shared future. A small home, a workshop filled with laughter instead of silence, a garden, a dog named Dusty chasing chickens, and maybe, if life was kind, a family. Two hearts once bruised and wandering had begun to find rhythm together. Not rushed, not forced, just real. And the quiet love growing between them felt sturdier than anything Dean Murray had ever forged with his own hands. The sun had barely crested the ridge when Dean Murray stepped outside his cabin, letting the cool dawn breeze brush across his face. It carried the scent of sage, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of Vivian's herb garden, drifting in from her clearing. Morning in Dry Creek had never felt this gentle, this alive, this full of something he could almost call hope. Dusty trotted beside him, tail thumping lazily, as Dean tightened his grip on the small wooden box he'd kept hidden for so long. Inside lay the gold ring that had once broken him, but now somehow it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a beginning. Vivian was already awake, kneeling beside a row of young sage plants, her long dark hair loose today, feathers brushing her shoulders as she worked. She hummed quietly, an old Apache melody that blended with the rustle of the early morning wind. Dean took a slow breath and walked toward her. When she noticed him, she wiped her hands on her doeskin skirt and smiled. "You're up early, cowboy," she teased. "Sun's barely got its boots on." "Got something on my mind," Dean replied. "What is it?" she asked, tilting her head. Instead of answering, he reached into his coat and pulled out the box. Vivian's brows lifted playfully. "Oh," she said, half grinning, "you need me to be your hand model again? Show the folks how a ring is supposed to look?" Dean didn't smile. Not this time. "Vivian," he said softly, opening the box so she could see the simple gold band inside, "this isn't about a hand model." Her joking expression melted. The morning light caught her features, warm, earnest, steady, and she froze, breath hitching quietly. Dean continued, voice low and rough in the way men speak when they're telling the truth they've carried for far too long. "This ring, I bought it for someone who didn't want it, for someone who didn't want me." He paused, meeting Vivian's dark, steady eyes. "But somewhere along the way, I realized something." She whispered, "What's that?" "That a ring doesn't belong to the person you want to see its worth. It belongs to the one who doesn't need convincing." His voice deepened, warm with something new. Peace, maybe. "This ring found the right person long before I understood it." Vivian's lips parted slightly. Her eyes shimmered in the soft gold of sunrise, not from sadness, but from something tender, overwhelming. Dean stepped closer, holding the ring between them. "It's yours," he said. "If you'll have it, if you'll have me." For a heartbeat, neither moved. It was the kind of stillness only frontier mornings could hold. Quiet, reverent, filled with meaning that didn't need decoration. Vivian blinked, and a single tear gathered at the corner of her eye. Not falling, just shining. "Dean," she breathed. She looked at him as if seeing every piece of who he was. Broken, mended, honest, hers. "You're sure?" "Never been more sure. Her breath trembled on the exhale. Then she reached out, taking his rough, work-worn hand in both of hers. "If you choose me," she whispered, voice thick but steady, "then I choose you. In every sunrise this land ever gives us." Dean placed the ring gently on her finger. It slid into place perfectly, like it had been made for her and her alone. Vivian lifted her hand toward the sky, watching the thin band glint in the early light. No crowd gathered, no piano played, no fancy tablecloths or chandeliers. Just the wide open land, the pale gold sun lifting over the ridge, and two people who had found each other in the most unlikely, healing way. She looked back at him with a soft smile. "A ring doesn't need to be big, Dean," she murmured. "It just needs to fit, and this fits me exactly." Dean cupped her cheek gently, his thumb brushing the warm skin beneath her eye. "No more running," he whispered. "No more empty days," she answered. Dusty barked once, as if announcing approval, and the two of them laughed, a sound bright enough to quiet every ghost of hurt still lingering inside them. Under the rising western sun, with dust beginning to sparkle in the light, Vivian slipped into Dean's arms, not as someone seeking rescue, and not as someone filling a void, but as the woman he had chosen, who chose him back, freely and fully. And for the first time in a long, lonely life, Dean Murray felt whole. Dry Creek had seen plenty of spectacles, rodeos, bar fights, ranch feuds, cattle auctions, but it had never seen a wedding as simple or as quietly beautiful as the one between Dean Murray and Vivian Reed. There were no ribbons strung across the street, no brass bands, no crowd dressed in their Sunday best. Just the two of them standing in the wooden doorway of the town hall, under a sky so blue it felt like a blessing. The justice of the peace looked up from his ledger with a small smile. He'd married ranchers, widows, miners, and drifters, but never a love quite like this. Vivian wore a white dress she had sewn herself, a soft, flowing garment adorned with tiny Apache beads stitched into the seams. Each bead represented something sacred: protection, blessing, belonging. When she walked, the beads shimmered like quiet starlight. Dean stood beside her in a clean shirt in his old leather coat, still faintly dusted from the forge no matter how hard he tried to brush it clean. But Vivian didn't mind. If anything, she loved that trace of soot, evidence of the man he truly was. When they exchanged vows, their voices were low but steady, as if speaking directly to the earth beneath their feet. Dean's large, work-worn hands trembled only once, when he slid the gold ring onto Vivian's finger. That same ring Claire once dismissed as too small now shone brighter than anything in the room. Not because it was new or polished or expensive, but because it finally rested on the hand of someone who cherished it. After the ceremony, there was no grand reception, no band, no fancy supper. They simply walked home. Dusty trotted ahead of them, tail wagging proudly, as if he understood he was escorting the bride and groom. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dirt road, and the breeze carried the scent of wild sage from the hills. Their shared life unfolded not with fireworks, but with quiet, steady rhythms that became the heartbeat of their home. Mornings began with the crackle of the stove as Vivian warmed coffee while Dean fed the horses. Sometimes she'd grind herbs for remedies. Sometimes he'd patch a wagon before breakfast was even ready. Dusty would bark at passing riders, proud guardian of a world that finally made sense. Afternoons echoed with the ring of Dean's hammer striking iron on the anvil. Each strike marked time, sturdy and sure. Vivian would work in her herb garden nearby, humming soft Apache songs that floated through the air like forgotten lullabies. Occasionally, she'd pause to glance at Dean, his brow furrowed in focus, his shirt clinging to sun-warmed skin, his eyes softening whenever he caught her looking. Evenings were their favorite. They would sit on the porch steps, plates balanced on their knees, eating cornbread, stew, or whatever simple meal they cooked together. Above them, the stars stretched across the sky like a woven blanket of silver threads. Sometimes they talked about their past, painful, crooked, full of scars. Other times they talked about their dreams, small but true. A bigger workshop, a thriving herb garden, maybe someday a child running barefoot through the dust. But more often than not, they didn't need words at all. The silence between them wasn't empty like before. It was comfortable, warm, content. The kind of silence that only exists between two people who've chosen each other fully. One night, as they watched the moon rise over the valley, Dean glanced at the ring on Vivian's hand. It glowed softly in the silver light. "I used to think that ring was a mistake," he murmured. Vivian rested her head on his shoulder. "It wasn't," she said. "It was waiting for the right story." Dean smiled, slow, deep, grateful. He finally understood something life had tried to teach him the hard way. Sometimes you have to lose someone who never saw your worth to find the person who sees nothing but it. And there, on their quiet patch of Western Earth, with a dog at their feet, a forge behind them, herbs growing steady, and love blossoming softly in their shared home, Dean Murray realized he'd stopped surviving and finally started living.